Welcome to the debate. Imagine spending 5 years of your life watching a television broadcast promise you the bloodiest, most spectacular superhero clash in history, only to end...
To end with an absolute whimper, yes.
Well, to end with the invincible villain crying on his knees and the surviving heroes, settling down to work at a suburban electronics store. If you were watching this broadcast at home on your sofa, you were probably left reeling.
Reeling from the sheer incompetence of it, I imagine.
I completely disagree. The question we are unpacking today regarding the polarizing series finale of The Boys, Season 5, Episode 8, titled Blood and Bone, is this. Does this broadcast deliver a masterfully profound and uncompromising subversion of the superhero myth? Or
does it completely collapse under the weight of rushed plotting and a frankly ghastly tonal whiplash between bleak nihilism and completely unearned sentimentality?
precisely the framing? Now, I am arguing that the finale is a brilliant, deeply tragic culmination of the series' core themes about power and vengeance.
And I will be arguing that the broadcast is severely hampered by a suffocatingly frantic 60-minute runtime, leaning on overly saccharine resolutions that fundamentally betray the show's previously lauded cynical edge.
Right. Well, to kick things off, my perspective on what we just witnessed is that this finale perfectly executes the show's central thesis on the corrupting nature of absolute power. I mean, look at what they did with Homelander.
Oh, they ruined him.
No, they elevated the text. Here is a terrifying antagonist who literally declares himself a god on live television during that chilling Easter Sunday broadcast. To take that figure and reduce him to a powerless, whimpering, begging mortal is a stroke of unadulterated narrative genius.
Genius is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting in that sentence.
It is accurate. Furthermore, we get Butcher's tragic descent into becoming the very monster he sought to destroy, which culminates in his attempt to release the soup virus into the water supply. It is a beautifully realized poetic fulfillment of the series' long-running motif of heart versus hate. It is, frankly, challenging television crafted for an audience capable of holding two opposing emotional truths at once.
Oh, I see. So if one dislikes it, one simply lacks the intellectual capacity for it. How very convenient for you.
I didn't say that, but
I come at it from a distinctly different angle, primarily because I am evaluating how those lofty themes actually translated to the screen. Look, while that destination sounds terribly profound scribbled on a whiteboard somewhere, the execution we were subjected to was deeply flawed. The broadcast suffers from massive, frankly jarring tonal whiplash.
tonal whiplash?
Absolutely. It rapidly shifts between forced, predictable sentimentality, like Kimiko's somehow unlocking her latent nuclear powers via a hallucinatory ghost vision of Frenchie urging her to use the power of love, and then visceral, bleak violence.
But that juxtaposition is the point.
It is an undisciplined mess. To cram so many major, life-altering character resolutions into a single hour of television severely undercuts any narrative weight the finale might have hoped to possess. It felt like a fundamental lack of aesthetic discipline.
I see why you might think that, but let me offer a different perspective on the execution, starting right at that central climax in the Oval Office. If you actually examine the sonic design and the stark staging of Homelander's defeat, it is nothing short of masterful.
The sound design? Really? That is your defense?
Yes, because it informs the thematic weight. The composer, Christopher Leonards, brilliantly avoids the trap of utilizing exultant, heroic, Howard Shore-style orchestrals. There is no triumphant brass section when Butcher finally exacts his revenge. There is only the sickening, visceral, splurt, crack, splat sound effect of Butcher's crowbar tearing into the skull of a depowered man. And Carl Urban's chillingly flat delivery of the line, "This is for my Becca."
Well, I will certainly grant you that the sound design of a skull caving in was suitably vile, but is visceral shock the only artistic achievement we are aiming for here?
It is not merely about the shock. It is about the thematic resonance. Think about the classic mythological trope of slaying the dragon. We spent 5 seasons anticipating the moment St. George runs the beast through with his lance. We think we want the catharsis of the superhero punching the villain into the sun.
As one does in this genre, yes.
Exactly. But the broadcast brilliantly subverts our desire for a sanitized victory by revealing the dragon to be nothing more than a pathetic, weeping boy on his knees. He is begging for his life, offering sexual favors just to survive. It is a brilliant refusal to give the audience the traditional heroism they crave.
That is a terribly compelling argument regarding the psychology of catharsis, I must admit. But have you considered the utterly farcical mechanics utilized to bring the dragon to its knees in the first place?
Farcical.
Utterly farcical. Now, don't misunderstand me. I acknowledge Anthony Starr's performance here. His portrayal of a terrified, newly powerless Homelander, desperately trying to comprehend his own frailty, was a masterclass. The actor elevated the dreadful material.
He was sublime, yes.
He was. However, I sharply critique the mechanical plot devices dragged out to achieve that moment. We are forced to watch Kimiko, a character defined by brutal trauma, suddenly emit nuclear-like beams fueled by the power of affection, love.
It wasn't just Kimiko.
It feels like a cheesy, over-the-top trope pulled directly from a children's cartoon. It fundamentally clashes with the brutal, grounded reality of the crowbar execution that immediately follows. It is akin to trying to marry a Pixar film to a Quentin Tarantino bloodbath.
Wait, I want to pause on that because I'm not sure I buy your point about Kimiko's powers being just a cheesy trope. If we actually look at the underlying mechanics of Compound V established in the show's lore, there's a very real biological logic to it.
Biological logic? Good heavens, I am all ears.
Yes, absolutely. Think about how Compound V actually works. It is a chemical that amplifies the host's physiological and psychological state. For 5 seasons, Vought has intentionally kept their soups in a state of high cortisol and adrenaline. They are fueled by stress, trauma, narcissism, and fear.
And your point is?
That is the baseline emotional frequency of a Vought superhero. When Sage earlier pushed Kimiko to unleash her rage, Kimiko selflessly spared her. So when Kimiko, in that moment, with Frenchie's vision, completely shifts her nervous system away from a trauma response and into a state of oxytocin and deep empathy, the biological expression of the compound V fundamentally changes.
It neutralized the V in Homelander's system because it was the exact chemical inverse of the hate that fuels him. It is a deliberate biological counterpoint.
I am sorry, but I just do not buy that. Let me tell you why. You can cite biological lore and cortisol levels all you want, but television is an experiential medium, not a medical journal.
It requires an engaged viewer.
Oh, do spare me. The juxtaposition you are defending feels, on screen, like the symptom of a chaotic writer's room unable to decide what genre they are occupying. One moment we have Kimiko glowing with the warmth of 1,000 hugs, and in the next, we have mother's milk shoving a titanium ball gag into the mouth of the soup. Oh, Father, causing the man to explode in a shockwave of gore. It is an undisciplined carnival of tonal inconsistencies.
But that tonal whiplash is the exact point of the show. It has always juxtaposed the grotesque with the profoundly human. But let us move past the execution of Homelander because that hollow victory is exactly what triggers the real tragedy of the broadcast. We need to talk about what happens the minute that crowbar drops. Because with the dragon dead, Butcher suddenly has no target for his rage except the world itself.
Right. The pivot to the virus.
Exactly. The transition from the execution to Butcher crossing the moral event horizon is deeply compelling. And for anyone listening who isn't familiar with the term, the moral event horizon is that psychological point of no return in a narrative. It is the moment a flawed anti-hero completely sheds the hero part and just becomes the villain.
Yes, we are aware of the terminology.
Butcher's attempt to release the anti-soup compound V virus into the world's water supply at Vought Tower is the inevitable consequence of his blind quest for vengeance. He got what he wanted, Homelander's blood on a crowbar, but it cost him his soul.
His demise at Hughie's hands and that agonizing dying realization that he had become just as monstrous as the entity he was trying to destroy is the ultimate emotional payoff of their entire relationship.
I completely reject this defense, purely on the grounds of pacing. You are trying to defend the psychology, but I am looking at the sheer, suffocating mechanics of the broadcast. It is like shifting gears from fifth to first while driving 90 miles an hour. The narrative transmission just shatters.
I don't see how it shatters. The velocity is...
Let me pose a simple question. If Butcher's realization that he has become a mass-murdering monster is genuinely meant to be the broadcast's ultimate thematic tragedy, how can we possibly justify framing his complete psychological descent, his hesitation upon seeing Hughie's face, and his literal death into the final frantic minutes of a 60-minute runtime?
Because the brevity reflects the frantic nature of a mind that is finally broken. The velocity of the sequence isn't an accident, it is entirely intentional. Once Homelander is dead, Butcher's purpose is gone, and the collapse is instantaneous.
Utter drivel. It is the hallmark of a frantic production, not a frantic mind. A monumental character shift of this magnitude is entirely suffocated by the restrictive canvas they forced into. Cramming it into the tail end of an already overstuffed hour renders the emotional shift wholly unearned.
It doesn't.
We jump from Homelander's execution to Vice President Ashley Barrett being ousted, to Stan Edgar resuming his post, directly to Butcher rigging a doomsday device. The narrative literally suffocates under the sheer volume of plot points being frantically ticked off a checklist. If you were watching this on your sofa, you might have felt a twinge of emotion when Butcher died. But 10 minutes later, you were likely scratching your head wondering how we arrived there with such absurd haste.
I am simply not convinced by that line of reasoning because it willfully ignores the established momentum of the series. Butcher has been teetering on the edge of this specific precipice for years. We didn't need another half hour of screen time to watch him brood in the aftermath. The groundwork was already meticulously laid.
Meticulously.
Right. Yes, meticulously. Think back to his rejection by his adopted son, Brian, who correctly identified that Butcher was not a good person either. That was the final push. The tragedy is succinct because his end was inevitable the moment he struck Homelander. When Hughie shoots him in the stomach to save millions and Butcher forgives him as he dies, even seeing his slain brother Lenny's face in Hughie, it perfectly encapsulates the original themes without lingering unnecessarily.
Without lingering unnecessarily, you say, while conveniently ignoring the subsequent epilogue that lingers so egregiously it practically grinds the broadcast to a halt, which brings us, organically, to my biggest grievance: the farcical tension between the show's trademark satire and the insufferable sentimentality of its final moments.
The epilogue. Look, I maintain that the episode's biting political satire is perfectly, and I mean necessarily, balanced by the bittersweet hope of those final scenes.
Hope? You call that pandering drivel hope?
We got Homelander's terrifying Trump-esque scorched earth Easter broadcast, complete with the casual murder of the Elon Musk analog Disruptor, whose corpse is subsequently launched into space. The satire of our current political reality remains as razor-sharp as ever, but a narrative cannot survive on cynicism alone.
It survived on it quite comfortably for 5 years.
But you cannot end on it without exhausting the audience. Mother's Milk adopting Ryan and marrying with Neek, and Hughie and Annie settling down and naming their unborn baby Robin acts as a necessary pressure valve.
A pressure valve.
Yes. It is akin to taking a deep breath of clean air after nearly drowning. If the finale had ended solely on Butcher's miserable death in Vought Tower, wouldn't it cross the line from a meaningful narrative warning about the corrupting nature of power into a relentless, pointless exercise in misery? The survival and domestic peace of the remaining boys provide the necessary contrast to make Butcher's tragedy actually land.
What you call a pressure valve, I call a saccharine happy wrap that completely betrays the cynical DNA of the entire enterprise. Consider the resolutions you are defending. Kimiko adopting a puppy and frolicking off to France.
She deserved peace.
Hughie Campbell settling down to manage a suburban electronics store while expecting a child. These are the most predictable, pandering resolutions imaginable. This is a broadcast that built its entire cultural cachet on ruthlessly mocking these exact, tidy, traditional Hollywood endings.
It's not a Hollywood ending.
It spent years sneering at the very concept of the white picket fence resolution, only to desperately scramble over that same fence the moment it needed to conclude its own narrative. It is hypocritical in the extreme.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it entirely differently. It is not a betrayal, it is an evolution. The mockery you speak of throughout the series was directed at manufactured corporate happy endings, the VOD-approved narratives that sell merchandise and cinema tickets.
Chuckles condescendingly.
What Hughie, Annie, and MM achieved is completely divorced from the superhero spectacle. They find quiet, banal human happiness precisely by walking away from the grand, violent narratives of gods and monsters. Hughie working in an electronics store isn't a glossy Hollywood ending. It is the ultimate rejection of Vought's definition of special. Naming the baby Robin, a nod to the tragedy that incited Hughie's entire journey in Episode 1, brings the story full circle. It proves that trauma can eventually give way to healing.
Naming the child after his pulverized former girlfriend. Yes, how delightfully poetic. If only the production possessed a fraction of your vivid imagination, they might have actually earned such a generous interpretation.
The interpretation is entirely supported by the text.
Instead, we are subjected to a montage of unearned domestic bliss that feels entirely disconnected from the blood-soaked reality we just spent an hour enduring. Let us not forget, the Deep was just impaled by a vengeful octopus a few scenes prior in what was essentially a slapstick distraction.
It wasn't a distraction, it was...
Yet, we are supposed to seamlessly transition from a cephalopod assassination into teary-eyed reflections on fatherhood. The broadcast attempts to have its cake, eat it, and then clumsily smear it all over the audience's face.
But the Deep dying at the hands, or rather the tentacles, of the aquatic creatures he so often exploited and failed is poetic justice. It reinforces the central mechanism of the finale. Every character reaps exactly what they sow.
Oh, please.
They do. Homelander sowed fear and died a coward. Butcher sowed hate and died a monster. The Deep exploited the vulnerable and was consumed by them. Hughie sowed compassion, and he gets to be a father. It is incredibly structurally sound.
It is structurally sound only if you are constructing a nursery rhyme. For a piece of purportedly sophisticated political satire, it is dreadfully trite.
Well, then let us summarize our positions, as it appears we are at a bit of an impasse on the thematic execution. I maintain that Blood and Bones successfully delivered a brutal, incredibly poignant conclusion to a 5-season cycle of violence. It bravely stripped its central antagonist of his mythic status, forced its anti-hero to face the horrific reality of his own vengeance, and ultimately reminded us that the only true victory against absolute power is the choice to embrace our quiet, flawed humanity.
And I maintain that the broadcast was a chaotic, ill-disciplined mess. It ultimately struggled and failed to balance its trademark cynical satire with a wildly uncharacteristic sentimentality. By compressing so many monumental psychological shifts into an entirely inadequate time frame, it rendered its supposed emotional payoffs farcical, leaving us with a conclusion that felt both rushed and deeply compromised.
I think we can, at the very least, acknowledge a strong point of convergence regarding the sheer caliber of the acting. Anthony Starr's raw, pathetic performance as the humiliated Homelander was undeniably powerful. To see him on his knees, stripped of his bravado and offering anything to survive, was a chilling spectacle entirely fitting to the character's comic roots.
I will certainly grant you that Starr was a solitary beacon of talent in the broadcast. His ability to project the terror of a deeply insecure man-child suddenly stripped of his omnipotence was a masterclass. It is simply a shame his performance was trapped within a framework that, in my view, simply couldn't support the weight of his talent.
As we reflect on the complex legacy of this show, it is worth noting that while the central, bloody battle is over, the narrative's lingering threads prove there is much more to explore within this universe. The quiet, bureaucratic reinstatement of Stan Edgar as Vought's CEO in the final moments suggests something profound.
Indeed.
It tells us that while the loud populist threat of Homelander has been neutralized by a crowbar, the insidious corporate machinery of power simply absorbs the shock and continues humming along. The real terror isn't a god shooting lasers from his eyes. It is the silent boardrooms that manufacture them.
Quite right. One can only hope that whatever corporate machinations follow in the inevitable spin-offs are handled with a modicum more pacing and grace than the spectacle we just unpacked today.
The stage of our tragedy has finally been cleared. The bodies have been dragged into the wings, the blood has been superficially mopped away, and the surviving players have wandered off to live their surprisingly quiet lives. Yet one cannot help but look at the empty stage and wonder if the true tragedy wasn't the violence we witnessed, but the horrifying ease with which the world will simply replace the monsters we've slain. Thank you for joining us.